There's a very close connection between democratization and mass violence. The more people participate in politics, the more people can participate in organized killing. And I do not think a nostalgia for that type of mass politics is in any way a good way to pitch re-institutionalization today. Once you have mass politics return on the left, that might imply that much scarier creatures are going to be born on the right, because then there will be a true perception of a threat to their social order.
The saying goes, if you want a friend in politics, get a dog. But on the left, for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, you didn't have to do that. You could just join a party or a union. And maybe you're still a member of a party or union now, but it's unlikely that it forms the complete world that lots of these institutions did in the past. You know the story. Through the late 20th century, we were forcibly individualized. But then around 2010, massive new global protest movements emerged. Occupy, the Arab Spring, and Black Lives Matter, which first bloomed in 2014 and then again in 2020. And these movements were massive. Tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people were involved in them, but they didn't crystallize into new kinds of organizations of a comparable size. Society became more politicized, but didn't always become more organised. And now we're left in the wake of those movements. This is what my guest this week, Anton Jäger, calls hyperpolitics. We discussed how politics has changed in this hyperpolitical era, the prospects of the return of fascism, and whether or not his thesis still holds true in the wake of the vast movements for Palestine and against ICE in the US, and with the Gen Z revolutions that are currently flowing around the world. Anton Jäger, welcome to Neuro Research.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
I want to start with something that's happening actually right now as we're speaking. We're speaking in the middle of February, but this has been going on for about 6 weeks now, and it is the resistance to ICE in Minneapolis. ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency in America, which has been massively beefed up, given, I think, one figure I saw a while ago was about $90 billion, enormous sums of cash. And it's launched what's called Operation Metro Surge into Minneapolis. And as a response to that, the people of Minneapolis, pretty much overwhelmingly, seemingly almost unanimously, have come out onto the streets day after day after day, organised blockades of ICE's vehicles, organised resistance to the arrest of people, organised protests, organised something they call a strike. These are forms of politicisation. They're forms of institutionalisation in some ways, institution building. Or is that not what's going on? How do you read this particular moment, this particular struggle in American politics now?
Politicization without any institutionalization, so without any institutional launching pads or in a form of pure spontaneity, is obviously a philosophical impossibility. It just doesn't exist. There's always some coordination that happens. There is always, as you say, some networks that have to be formed in order for you to be able to organize anything. So it's not the case that you can politicize without institutionalizing in a pure sense. The question I have more is what type of institutionalization accompanies the types of politicization we're looking at now, and what kind of timescale is it capable of spreading itself out over. So the fact that you have, let's say, whatever, a WhatsApp group, or you have some kind of institutional backing, or you have informal gatherings in which people coordinate and, let's say, exchange certain instruments and tools with which they can organize the resistance, that seems to me absolutely logical. And anyone who's ever organized a protest or tried to launch one will see that you need a basic institutional channel to get it done. That was also the case in 2020. And it's been the case with, all of the protest movements in the last 10 to 15 years, that they have an institutional minimum, which means that pure spontaneity is just a practical impossibility. The question to ask once again is whether you're able to build the kind of institutional structures that allow you to maintain that protest movement over a longer time period than a couple of months. So whether ICE, of course, has state funding behind it, so that makes it easier to sustain that repressive effort, and that means there might still be busy engaging in it, let's say, a year to a year and a half time. The question is, can you then maintain the kind of crystallization institutional structures to also organize a resistance at that time? And the second question to be asked is, how formalized it and how official is it? So what is the degree of informality you have within the institutional structure you have? And I think that's precisely what the thesis is trying to get at. It's not trying to say that politicization can somehow happen without any degree of institutionalization, but the types of institutionalization we have are not robust enough to survive over a long-term cycle and thereby inevitably peter out. And because the crystallization doesn't survive into the next cycle, you have to repoliticize by reinventing a new institutional structure altogether. And I think that
I want to get into the kind of the... Sorry, go on.
Yeah, and that's also the indurability or the impermanence of the kind of movements we're looking at, is because the institutional structure has to be constantly reinvented and reestablished. I think there inevitably you get into the question of what does it mean if you don't have sort of official or more formal institutions with certain representative and inevitably also hierarchical structures, then how do you repoliticize by then involving a new institutional infrastructure that looks very different from the one you had before? So once again, there is no such thing as a chemically pure spontaneous politics. There will always be a degree of institutional leverage you need for it. It's more the question of what does it mean if that institutional layer only persists for like a couple of months, and then when the next wave of politicization happens, you basically have to reintroduce it. And I mean, once again, the social science predictions are some of the most difficult things to do. So I'm in no way confident saying that maybe in a year this will no longer be there, or maybe in a year there will be no institutional residue. But we can look back at the track record of the last 10 to 15 years and realize that maintaining those institutional structures over the long haul has proven quite difficult.
So I do want to get into some terms just in a second, because I think there are lots of things kind of flying around here that we might want to grab onto and use as kind of concepts. But just on this last point about whether or not these institutions are durable, the logic of targeting Minneapolis as a particular place, right, as a particular city, and even as a particular state, right, is that this was the ground zero of the George Floyd protests that came in 2020 and were these absolutely enormous things. I mean, there's no denying the sort of the scale of them. The question is as you're saying, the kind of the permanence of them, their institutional abilities to sustain themselves over the course of many, many years. But in some ways, I think the discovery of Minneapolis is that there actually were what you're calling crystallization, but crystallization at a lower scale. So instead of crystallization at the level of, and here is the Socialist Party of Minneapolis, right, and they have a kind of institutional structure, networks, neighborhoods, groups of people who participated in the BLM movement in 2020 did sustain themselves. There's one square in Minneapolis where people met every single day, right, for 5 years. And part of those networks have been sort of reactivated. So I totally get the point about the kind of the possibility of the kind of the long duration of an institution. But what strikes me about Minneapolis is that maybe even this is what we are seeing now, right? So that's 5 years later. The same networks are now being reactivated. They're in a period of slumping, right? Because there was a Biden administration, there was a degree of depoliticization after BLM, but those networks are still there, right? Maybe the kind of crystallization point is that we're looking for smaller crystals, right? Rather than this kind of giant, kind of monolithic thing we can name and give a hierarchy and a face to.
Yes, but then the question becomes rather, even if the institutions do persist in some way, the lack of formality just means that it's very difficult to draw or to make a point of like who is in and who is out of them. So there's a question just of the membership and what relationship of accountability you have between the people who organize it and then who were in it initially in 2020. And then the question again becomes, what does that mean for the capacity not just to resist such an assault, but also to address a power balance over the longer term? So to me, it's not the case that like it seems very obvious that the same set of people who in 2020 would be mobilized for the mass protests at the time would find themselves reactivated and would have a minimum of network connections left in order to be mobilized in 2025 or 2026. The question is rather, can you then guarantee the same turnout in 2020? And what were the original programmatic aims in 2020? And what are the aims in 2025 and 2026? And where, let's say, do we see the practical results of what was actually practically demanded in 2020 when it comes to defunding police or doing something about the massively skewed balance between carceral and social spending in the United States? And I think, once again, the persistence of these institutions seems purely logical to me. As far as, like, obviously the people who turned out in 2020 would have stayed in touch in some way. Then they might not have had an official institution, but there were always some channels in which they were communicating. In 2025, 2026, when the Trump administration launches its next assault, specifically on Minneapolis, also as the symbolic site of the 2020 BLM uprising, then they would be reactivated. The question is, once again, what does this look like in 5 years again? And can we say that the even more vaguer policy aims that were set for the movement in 2020 have been reached in 2025? And then also for the anti-ICE protests now, where do they want to be in 2030 as to the American deportation machine, which has obviously been a bipartisan effort? Can we set certain standards as to what we want to happen? So once again, there's no such thing as complete deinstitutionalization. Something remains and lingers over those 5 years. The question is rather, what aims were set in 2020? Can we hope that in 5 years we are getting a bit closer to them? Same question can be asked about 25 and 2026, namely, where do we want the state of American immigration policy to be, given that it's now also being used not just as an assault on people who have less of a claim on American citizenship, but American citizens themselves. I think this is a really striking aspect of the repression, is that it's now also turning into something that targets American citizens themselves. And then the defensive argument becomes more and more difficult, because you do also have to ask the question of how migration policy is turning into an all-out assault on certain aspects of American citizenship for American citizens themselves.
And indeed, indigenous Americans as well, which is like quite a shocking idea. I mean, obviously, that's completely just like historically happened for literally centuries. But the idea that there would be a sort of immigration question around indigenous Americans is of course, like kind of repulsive and quite alarming in some ways. Let's zoom back out and state for the record what your thesis is, what those broader kind of concepts that we're mobilizing here are. What is hyperpolitics? Okay,
enormously important question. I think this is the kind of elevator pitch I inevitably have to make when I have to speak about this book. So the very easy, or let's say concise definition I usually give is that it's a process of repoliticization without reinstitutionalization. Now that sounds very wordy. It's a kind of social scientific jargon that I don't think is particularly suited for the audience that the book is aiming at, but that is the shortest way to describe it. So it indicates a process in which political activity is on the rise, but it doesn't go hand in hand with a re-embedding or a channeling of that political activity within specific institutional context. So hyperpolitics indicates a change in political culture, particularly in what Branko Milanovic has called the political West in the last 10 to 15 years. I think you can make some global extrapolations, but I'm much more cautious about those because my empirical grasp of those non-European or non-Western cases is simply too weak for me to confidently make claims about them. But within the West, or let's say the OECD West, taken more broadly, hyperpolitics stands for a mutation in political culture in which there has been a rise in political activity on all kinds of different indices and metrics, but it's not gone hand in hand with a return of a more institutionalized form of political engagement, and rather with an accelerated decline and disintegration of those institutional bonds, or their replacement with very short-term and informal forms of institutional connections. And of course, hyperpolitics as a concept can only be understood in contrast. So hyperpolitics finds its place in the decade of protest that mainly took off after 2008, 2009. And that means that the hyperpolitics I'm talking about inevitably is different from the so-called post-politics of the 1990s and the 2000s, but it's also very different from what I call the mass politics of the long 20th century, which is born somewhere in the late 19th, we could say, and then persists into the middle of the 20th century and really begins to unwind, I'd say, in the 1980s and 1990s. The 1970s are an interesting period because you see a sort of second breath for the mass political age in which a new generation, I think, rediscovers the capacity for mass institutionalized political engagement. But it's really at the close of the century in the 90s that you see that mass politics is now on the verge of extinction and is being replaced by a mode of political engagement in which both institutional and political activity is slumping. And that gives you obviously two axes, or let's say two dimensions in which you can compare and track all these political forms. So mass politics is a form of politics that's both highly politicized but also highly institutionalized. So if you read, for example, Eric Hobsbawm's memoirs and his explanation of why he remained in the Communist Party even after the crises of conscience in 1956 and 1968, it becomes very clear that he could not imagine being political outside of an institution like a party. Now, the question of what is your political view or what are your political opinions in the 30s and 40s to him was inevitably connected to the question, what party card am I carrying? So mass politics means high politicization, both on the right and the left. So it's not as if this engagement is in any way exclusive to forces on the left, but also high institutionalization, namely political action is very difficult to conceive outside of these organized institutional channels. Post-politics has a double minus to it insofar as it implies a decline of institutional engagement. So people are handing in their party cards, they're leaving unions or being pushed out of unions. And there's also a general crisis of what mainstream political scientists usually call civil society. But at the same time, there's also a decline on the politicization axis. So fewer people are voting, fewer people are participating in protests, fewer people are striking. Because, of course, for example, it's possible to strike outside of an institutional context. That's precisely the point of a wildcat strike, is that you're not necessarily a member of a union, but you can still engage in strike activity. But the 90s and 2000s are basically characterized by both an institutional and a political drop. What hyperpolitics tries to describe, and it's also something that you can pick up in a bunch of quantitative data from the 2010s, is that there's been a remarkable rise on the political axis in 2008, 2009. So there's been an increase in electoral turnout. Some examples, the US has seen record numbers in 2020 and 24. Brexit referendum in the UK was, I think, the most numerous vote in British history. And you can also see that, for example, political violence has made quite a spectacular return, particularly in the US. When you look at, let's say, assassination attempts on presidential candidates, but we can obviously also talk about certain types of paramilitary activity. But as we're looking at all these indices of rising political engagement, we're also looking at a continued decline or continued erosion of these organized political structures, whether it's party membership, union membership, of course also religious affiliation, and all types of other civic institutions. They've seen a continued decline since 2008, 2009. And the reason that the concept of hyperpolitics is introduced in the book is mainly because it tries to capture the novelty of that situation. Because in a purely quantitative sense, throughout the 20th and the 19th century, it's not very easy to find a precedent for this K-shaped or scissor-shaped development. So rising politicization but declining institutionalization. And that means obviously that hyperpolitics shares some similarities with mass politics in that it feels highly politicized. So that political engagement is at record highs. But it obviously also has a continuity with post-politics insofar as it has not seen a recovery of the institutional bonds which were typical of the mass political age in the 20th century. And it's this new grin without a cat, as I call it in the book, which the book tries to anatomize and which it also tries to place in a sort of longer chronology of political forms that runs across the 19th, 20th, and 21st century.
What's the single sort of like image of hyperpolitics to you? Because I mean, the book, which I'm now holding up, begins with the Wolfgang Tillmans, right? This is an image of post-politics, right? This is 1989, I want to say, in just after the fall of the Berlin, or like, is this in Berlin? Where is this? This
is in London, actually. So he clarified that these are London pictures. There's a couple of other pictures in the series that are from Berlin, but this is a London picture, yeah.
And it shows a woman dancing, I assume at a rave, like in a kind of like almost state of ecstasy, a forgetting of politics, right? Like when this kind of blissed out, going to the rave, not engaging with politics. In some ways, it seemed for people of that generation, obviously I was minus several years old, but there was a feeling that politics had been sort of solved or resolved, and that now there'd be kind of merely technocratic organization of the world from this point onwards, right? Politics wasn't something you needed to be engaged with. It was the twiddling of very small sort of tweaks in the budget or something like this, right? That's an image of, so you've got that image on the front, but that's not an image of hyperpolitics. Slightly misleading there, verso. What is the image of hyperpolitics that you would reach for? Like, is it the call out post? Is it the like, what is the single image of hyperpolitics that seems sort of to grasp that for you?
I think the call out post is a tempting option for a variety of people who've written about contemporary political culture, but I don't think it's a very fair representation, of what contemporary political engagement looks like, because people do turn out to do things. It's not as if they just sit behind a screen. And I think there is a monocausal or reductive tendency in some of these analyses insofar as they see everything of the contemporary political age happening online, and thereby you can easily say, oh, let's say the call-out post or the modes of sociability which are typical of the online are the best way to capture this. And I don't think that's quite fair insofar as people do leave their house occasionally, not just occasionally, but also at repeated intervals, in a way that political engagement is not just something that happens on a screen. It's obviously heavily mediated by screens. Yeah. I think that is very obvious. So you go out and you take your phone and you capture what's happening outside, but still things are happening outside. I mean, to stay within the theme, so Tillmans himself has made a series of portraits of BLM protesters, which are actually very interesting and, aesthetically quite pleasing portraits, which also indicate his own change of mind about the so-called utopia of post-history discovered in the 1990s and the 2000s. So it's a story that's very closely connected to him to Berlin, but obviously also to the UK in the 1990s and 2000s. Many of the things he says about the kind of liberation from history and the liberation from collective structures he tried to capture with his pictures at the time do remind us of some of the writings on rave culture that Mark Fisher wrote, in that to him they become sort of last depository of certain utopian energies that were no longer able to be released after the 1980s and 1990s. So in Fisher's argument, he feels that the political passion or libido, which people could no longer invest in collective social change from the 1980s onwards, are then transferred into a different area, the more privatized area of, let's say, rave culture and parties in the 1990s and 2000s. And then Tillmans, after 2008, 2009, begins to realize that maybe now a space is opening up to deposit that energy no longer in the more privatized forms of festivity or rave culture, but also in the public square or the political sphere. And in those portraits of BLM protesters, there's a very, I wouldn't say awkward, but there's something uneasy about the aesthetic strategy he's pursuing there, insofar as they have a continuity with the ravers he's portraying in the 1990s, but obviously they also look like a portrait of a typical mass demonstration you get from the 20th century. It's a very famous template of 20th century mass art, namely the mass demonstration. And Tillmans is somewhere between, let's say, the more intimate, private portraits he makes of the ravers and then the mass portraits of the 20th century. But I think, once again, it's an excellent way of illustrating, or let's say representing, the phenomenon which the book is discussing. If you go on Tillmans' Instagram now, it's quite interesting to see that he's in no way only posting pictures of some of the events or some of the parties he used to capture, but he's constantly posting opinion pieces from the New York Times. He talks about Timothy Snyder prophesying a return to the 1930s. There's a lot about Ukraine and Russia as well, of course. So with him, I think there is a sense that we are being teleported back to the era of mid-century fascism and the darkest days of European history. But at the same time, I think in his own works, he's exemplifying that there isn't that easy a return to that era either. So I think Tillmans remains the exemplar of what I'm talking about.
I always think that sports people have this kind of like mythic status in our society. And it's always very disappointing when you see them doing these amazing physical feats on the pitch, to hear them do interviews afterwards. They're full of lactic acid. They're struggling to communicate anything. And I often feel the same thing about artists, right? They should not be allowed to speak publicly, and only their work, which contains much larger amounts of what we might call adorning and truth content, right? Like, should be allowed to present, and people should not be allowed to. If you're a famous artist, you're not allowed to post on Instagram. That's my rule. I do want to kind of like agree with you there on that resistance to like the domination of our discourse by social media or misinformation or disinformation or, sort of endless distraction, right? Which I don't think adequately describes what's happened in the last 10 years, or even sort of 20 years, 25 years, right? Since that post-political moment. What are the other forces? What are the other tendencies that come to shape that transformation from the 1990s, from post-politics up this kind of left side of our diagram here, right, which is the side of less organization, but we are moving from having very low levels of politicization up to having very high levels of politicization. What are the other things that are driving this? Is it the great financial crisis and the consequent kind of foreclosure crisis in America and then across the Western Europe as well? Is it rising inequality? Is it transformation of gender as a kind of a experience? Like, what are the dimensions that are producing this kind of hyperpoliticization that are not screens bad?
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, the kind of monocausal social media story is something that's obviously quite convenient because it gives people a certain hammer and a nail. It's obviously also a story that was quite prevalent around the Brexit vote and the Trump vote, where the idea was that the Russian bots somehow made sure that the upsets of that year could be explained purely by the misinformation that people found online. And of course...
And not because Clinton was like a psychopathic warmonger who had like destroyed, just complete cope, extraordinary cope. Really, it remains embarrassing 10 years on.
No, it's a profoundly anti-political reading. And I think in retrospect, we see just how, let's say, cynically anti-political it was, because if you really do attribute everything to digitalization, there's actually no way you can talk about the larger, quite dramatic social forces that already were visible by 2008, 2009, that were, let's say, ravaging lives all across the world, and which would obviously found some kind of political outlet at one point. So there's a whole causal mesh that's compressed into the 2 years, 2008, 2009, by which you already see that particularly protest activity begins to shoot up. I don't want to reduce everything to the great financial crash, but there is a tendency to assign, let's say, causal primacy to it, insofar as it obviously starts as an American crisis, but then quickly becomes a European and also a global crisis. There's even an argument that something like the Arab Spring is also a belated product of it. Namely, you have the freezing of international capital markets, which makes the lending these states usually engage into, for example, reduce food prices much more difficult, and thereby you have a series of food riots already in 2009, 2010 in Northern Africa, which then unleashes the first waves of the Arab Spring. Then Europe, of course, follows track and also begins to see people descending on the squares. And in particularly the southern half of Europe, it's very clear that the first wave of protests in 2010, 2011 is a product of the austerity packages that are already being implemented. So it's the political negotiation, or let's say the crisis management in the early 2010s that to me provides the causal key to explaining where repoliticization comes from. That's the initial fuse that is blown. I don't think you can reduce everything to it, because social media does play an enormously important role in accelerating that dynamic, in that it offers certain tools and instruments for mobilization that simply weren't available before. So there's a flammable environment that has been created by the political and social developments of the 1990s and 2000s. And if you launch this instrument into it of social media with a set of entry and exit costs that are much lower, which radically reduces the cost of political expression, it becomes very obvious that people would turn to these tools to mobilize in an era of repoliticization. We don't have to flatter, let's say, the tech oligarchs with the idea that the Arab Spring was a set of Facebook revolutions, or that even Occupy can somehow be explained by the fact that people suddenly had access to mobile phones to organize their protests. But it seems unreasonable to completely exclude that factor from the picture we're presenting here either, insofar as, yes, it obviously played a role. It's not the only driver, but it did accelerate. I think what is less talked about is, so you have the two first factors, great financial crash, how this spirals into a global crisis, and then the crisis manager that ensues from this, how this fissures the social contract. Then you have the facilitator of the internet. But what is less talked about, I think, is the constraints on collective action that exist in the 2010s, which I think were not as present in the 20th century, when the institutionalization of political engagement was in some ways a bit easier to pursue. And those constraints are quite hard to define. There are several political scientists that have actually tried to quantify them, and time again, it is quite a taxing and difficult exercise. But I usually I distinguish horizontal from vertical constraints. So horizontal constraints on collective action, which I think incentivize the hyperpolitical behavior we're talking about, are the fact that many parties or institutions that usually would be available for the absorption of political energy have completely insulated themselves from political pressure. And this is usually a process called the cartelization, or the so-called fusing of parties with the state.
Are we talking about here like the Labour Party or the Democrat Party? Those seem like the most obvious examples, or are we talking about something else?
Also on the right. So it's a process that happens both in the center left and the right. I mean, it just means that many institutions which previously would have been open to certain kinds of political pressure and political engagement, since the 90s and the 2000s have consciously chosen to isolate themselves from that. And I think, let's say, the Starmerite Labour Party is a very acute illustration of this, insofar as they do explicitly prefer to rule without a mass membership base. That obviously generates some problems, but it's a very explicit, conscious choice they've inherited from, of course, the Blairite era, where the idea is, if you can manage a party as purely a set of cadre or a cartel that can speculatively get its voters through PR and all kinds of consultancy and mass media bureaus, but they don't actually have to work with a mass membership base, and they prefer to push the base out once they're in, it's very much, I'd say, a vertical constraint on collective action, insofar as parties do not want people to join, because they now have alternative sources of funding, and it's obviously just an issue if you have all these members within the party, because they suddenly can make all kinds of demands which would not correspond to the preferences of the party elite, and particularly not the part of the state elite that needs the party elite to still get its access to power in some way. So this, I would say, is a vertical constraint. And then there are more extreme versions of a vertical constraint, which are just, let's say, the legal limits on unionization, for example, in the United States. Also in the UK, because they've become far more stringent in the last 10 to 15 years. So there's a vertical constraint. Then there's another set of constraints, which I consider horizontal constraints, which I see as a product of the proliferation of all kinds of exit options within contemporary society, which indicate that once you realize that it's not very easy to translate your individual grievances or demands into collective action, nowadays there is a whole set of alternative, purely individualistic channels through which you can express those preferences that simply weren't available before. And I think here, let's say, the expansion of, let's say, the financial industry and the access to private credit, the idea that if you have low wages, you can simply solve them by looking for different kinds of options, or becoming a small asset manager or an asset holder yourself, but also the idea that the internet now offers ways of political expression that are less mediated and much more immediate than anything that came before. Those are horizontal constraints which I would range more under, let's say, the contemporary political culture, and they're less visible than, let's say, a party that doesn't want people to join and doesn't want to rule in the name of a mass membership. So horizontal, vertical constraints, and then we can add the other causes, which are obviously great financial crash, plus the digitalization of the public sphere, which facilitates political expression in a way that simply wasn't possible across the 20th century. I just want to indicate, just imagine if you wanted to express yourself in the middle of the 20th century or earlier, if as an individual with certain political opinions, you either had to stand in the middle of a square and get a megaphone and people basically shout at people and communicate what your political grievances were. You had to print a couple of pamphlets and then hand them out on a field, or you had to have access to the editor of a newspaper or, let's say, the head of a party for you to be able to express your political opinion. And nowadays, what the internet has done, and this is, I'd say, I think, a structural transformation of the public sphere, or a new structural transformation of the public sphere, as Habermas himself has called it in a recent book, quite an important change. It's not the only change that matters, but it is an important change, and I don't think we should underestimate it either.
I think one of the kind of the key things there about the horizontal constraint and this idea of being able to kind of exit the field of institutional politics, but not necessarily exit politicization.
Yes.
The most sort of striking version of that for me is prediction markets, right? Where politics, or the practice of following politics, becomes like a very intricate thing, right? You have to really kind of know what's happening all the time. You have to really be locked in to news sources, to data streams, to understanding politics. But at the same time, your relationship to it is as a speculator, right? You are betting on whether or not certain news stories will be more likely or less likely to happen at some determined point in the future, right? Like this is a kind of like an approach to politics that is financialization, right? It's literally a financialization of politics, right? And that's a way of engaging with it that means that you don't really have to do anything necessarily, but you can still remain sort of locked in.
So if you're constantly gambling or betting on politics, you do obviously have to invest it in some way. You have to follow political journalism, you have to follow the news cycle. So there obviously is a degree of politicization that's required for it. But as you say, you have a completely non-agentive, unfree, purely speculative relationship to political events. And this is also why one of the opening quotes of the book is from the Kalshi election betting app, which is Wall Street wins every election. Now you can too with this app, which I think to me exemplifies this new relationship to politics. Namely, I'm heavily invested in it as a, let's say, collective activity. It obviously still happens. People engage in politics, but my own purchase on these political events is non-existent. And I'm going to basically cede any agency or any control over what the political end result is going to be, which obviously means you have no ideological preferences as to what happens politically either. Because if the question is, I'm going to maximize my revenue based on my predictions of certain political events, you might as well bet on the enemy, or you might as well bet on anyone who you consider as the most likely victor in a specific situation. So yes, it's the perfect illustration is for highly politicized, but without any ideological investments, and of course, a purely individual and not an institutional relationship to the practice of politics.
My favorite example of this is actually not about politics as such, although it would be a very big political news story if it happened, which is about the likelihood of the return of Jesus Christ. So I don't know if you know this, but according to prediction markets, Jesus Christ is more likely to return in an election year. You might think there are good theological reasons for this, right? The devil is coming. You know, what if Kamala Harris wins, right? She's the devil. Maybe Jesus will have to come back to save us. You know, it's not actually about that. What it's about is that at the beginning of the year, you put in a bet and you say, well, no, Jesus isn't going to come. Well, lots of people do that. But if you put in a bet for yes, eventually people who bet no only stand to gain 0.5%, 1% on their total investment. And so they will move out of the market into other markets sometime during the year, because there are many more lucrative things to bet on during election years, right? Individual states get 50-50 on swing states and so on. And so you're incentivized actually to bet, yes, Jesus will return in this year, because people who bet no will move out of the market and they will go elsewhere. And that will mean that your yes bet becomes more valuable, right? And so even sort of like profound theological questions are subject to this kind of extremely obscure market manipulation kind of dynamism. It's a very strange world out there. I recommend people sort of think about it a lot, if not actually participate in it, because you will lose your money.
Yeah, so the ambiguity is, of course, and this is something we can talk about. Now, these are quite sinister and sort of saddening examples of the repoliticization we're talking about. But do we really have to be nostalgic for the 90s and the 2000s? Insofar as if someone's constantly locked into the political news and is a kind of political news junkie, are there not at least some faint reasons for optimism you can discern in this change of political culture? And I think we need to be able to tolerate a certain ambiguity in this repoliticization, insofar as I have met people who clearly have a nostalgia for an era in which the political engagement was much lower and was less frenetic, which I don't think is the right reflex to have either.
Let's talk about the other kind of dimension of nostalgia that I think I often hear, which is essentially nostalgia for the era of mass politics. You mentioned, was it Hobsbawm earlier? You mentioned his memoirs?
Yes.
Like the idea that you would have to be in a political party in order to be political in any sense. But there is something domineering about that. There is something sort of quasi-authoritarian about that, about the ways in which your political opinions are set, organized around what it is someone else is telling you, right? There's a kind of there's a domination, right, there in the kind of the political life by political parties. Isn't there, like, should we be nostalgic for that earlier era, let's say the 1960s, 1970s, right, of mass politics? And to what extent is that even kind of a feasible thing now? Are we not, as people, just like strongly averse to the kinds of implicit authoritarianism that being in a political party entails?
Yes, absolutely. And I don't think the book trades in the easiest or, let's say, the cheapest form of nostalgia about this, in so far as it does indicate two things. Mass politics in no way was an exclusive pursuit of the left. There's a right-wing form of mass politics, which in many ways was also a response, of course, to left-wing strength. So let's say Nazism, or let's say all kinds of fascist parties were in many ways, of course, responses to a revolutionary threat from the left, in which they reproduced and they built out many of the party structures that the left pioneered in the late 19th century. And we only need to look at a sort of basic historical overview of the 1930s and 1940s to see what the results of mass political action on the right look like. And I'll be very explicit, even an event such as the Holocaust is impossible to understand if you don't see it within the context of mass political dynamism on the right. Because what the Holocaust basically entails is that you have the SS colonizing the state apparatus. The SS is a massive engine of social mobility. All kinds of people who can't make a career within the Wehrmacht go into the SS because actual merit does count for something there. And then as the war in the Eastern Front is unfolding and the SS is like constantly engaged in this dialectic, both with official state entities and then less official ones, and loads of people are trying in acts of one-upmanship and acts of social movement basically to get ahead, it is very, very clear that precisely that mass political dynamic is absolutely crucial in understanding the escalation into mass violence. So I do want to say that mass politics, so high politicization and high institutionalization, has enormously violent and potentially genocidal consequences. So there is absolutely no reason for nostalgia in that sense, in that depoliticization and deinstitutionalization have also entailed, of course, that political risks have been reduced and the risks of political violence are lower. So there's a famous book by sociologist Michael Mann about democracy and mass violence or mass killing, which I think makes a very similar point to the one I was making about the SS, where he does say there's a very close connection between democratization and mass violence. The more people participate in politics, the more people can participate in organized killing. And I do not think a nostalgia for that type of mass politics is in any way a good way to pitch reinstitutionalization today. If you want to revive that type of mass politics, there obviously is a political risk you might want to be interested in today. Like maybe you want to raise the stakes of contemporary politics, that's fine. But that's not going to work by insisting on the idea that you're going to be opening the portal to that kind of world again. The second point is obviously one about mandates and representation in institutions, is that if you look at the pictures that Tillmans makes in the 1990s and 2000s, you obviously also see people who are suddenly able to express certain individual identities and preferences that were completely smothered and unavailable before because they were blocked by the collective guardians of those institutions before. And I mean, very explicit example of this is, for example, Michel Foucault's relationship to the Communist Party. He himself joined as a student in the early 1950s because the reputation of the party, particularly in the wake of the resistance, was so unassailable that anyone who was intellectually and politically serious had to join. And throughout the 50s and 60s, the reckoning of Foucault with the party is also a realization that his own he would be suspicious of the notion of identity, of course, but his own desire to live a certain life was completely impossible within the orbit or within the range set by the party itself. It was a church for the left in many ways, and a large part of his free life had to happen outside of this church. I don't think we should in any way deny that the dissolution and the decline of those institutions in the 80s and the 90s does open up certain emancipatory options for people that simply weren't available before. And so, once again, the nostalgia for a certain type of mediocrity and conformity that was also part of the mass political age is not going to be the way to sell it today. At the same time, what I do think is that there are certain 21st century challenges around which people have now reached a certain political consciousness, but for which they don't have the institutional means to actually affect social change. And I do think you need to think about what it would mean to revive or rethink mass political engagement in the 21st century without thinking that you can clone a dinosaur. So this is an image I also use in the book, is to say you could find the DNA or the genomic data of a certain fossil from the 20th century, and then in a lab you can try and clone it and then release it into the world, but you know what's going to happen. The dinosaur will immediately die because it's not adapted to the current environment. And so let's say Foucault's Communist Party or even Hobsbawm's Communist Party is not going to survive in the 2020s. If you look at all kinds of left-wing sects, I think it indicates that you can only do so if you build a sort of small fortress that's completely separate from society. But you can think about the question of what a genetic hybrid looks like. So not a fossil that's been cloned, but at least a creature that incorporates some of the more durable, permanent elements of engagement you get from 20th century institutions and the high politicization we associate with contemporary protest politics. And that genetic hybrid, I don't think is impossible. I think there are certain examples of what that might look like across Europe, but also on a global scale. And I'm not voluntarist, but I also don't think there's such a thing as an impossible situation. So if you cannot return to the mass political age, this in no way means that you cannot reinvent it either. And I think the question the book asks is, if there is no way of going back to post-politics, and hyperpolitics is here to stay, and you cannot return to mass politics either, surely there might be an option that you can think of how you might combine some of the elements of previous eras, because if it has been done before, it can be done again. And I think this is the promise the book sets out, is how can hyperpolitics be changed into a new form of mass politics in a more 21st century setting? And of course there the question of strategy and the question of institutional forms becomes absolutely crucial, namely what would that look like? If it entails a party, what kind of party does it entail? And what is that party's relationship to contemporary society? And what, most importantly also, is its party relationship to the digital public sphere and the internet? Because it seems very clear to me that any party that wants a serious political presence in contemporary debates has to reckon at least with the digitalization of public debate today.
I completely agree with that. I think that's a very I think that's completely the case. I have here on the board a kind of collection of relatively recent events that come after, well, I think most of them come after you finished writing the book, right, in 2023. So we have the Mamdani campaign, we have the Nepal's Gen Z protests, where very famously now they elect a new head of state on a Discord channel. Obviously, it helps that the army also agrees with that, right? Which is maybe the most like classic bedrock form of a kind of institution in politics. But you also have the Bangladesh revolution. You also, I mean, while you're writing the book slightly earlier, the Sri Lankan revolution that ousts the Rajapaksa family from control of almost the entire political structure and indeed the entire economy. We have in 2023, I think it is, the French anti-pension reform movement, right, which I think ultimately doesn't succeed, but looks much more like the collection of relatively high density unions combining with the Gilets jaunes, this much more kind of inchoate, complex, maybe even kind of classically anti-political kind of movement. These two things combine and they form a sort of single unified front. And so I kind of wonder, like, my overall question here is something like, are we not seeing exactly what you're pointing to? Are we not seeing those new kinds of hybrid organizations, both extremely at home on the internet with new digital infrastructures, but that also maintain some of this kind of insurgency that characterized the anti-politics era, and also that allows for a certain degree of individual heterogeneity and freedom that those earlier mass politics lacked? And so I've drawn this on the diagram, people who are just listening to this, that it sort of curves back around. So we've still in that very high politicization era, but instead of being on the far left, where there's very little organizational structure or very little institutional structure, we're now moving back, since even the last sort of 2 or 3 years, towards having more organizational, institutional density. What do you say to that kind of thesis about the last, say, just like 2-3 years?
Yes. So once again, I do think there are always tendencies that point in a different direction. And this is also, I think, the only way I would have been able to write the book is if this was a book that said there is nothing in the last 10 to 15 years that entails any emancipatory promise or points beyond itself, then I don't think I would have been able to it, because it would just have been an exercise in relentless pessimism. And each of these moments, I think, do indicate, let's say, at least a desire and ambition, not just for radicalism, but also for institutionalization. To me, the key question remains, what is the timeline or what is the survival date of each of these institutions? Because when you talk about the genetic hybrid or the cloned fossil, the question to me is, when is an organization born and when does it die? And can it survive through something like an electoral and then even a longer term cycle? And with the Gilets jaunes, for example, if we take that as a case study, I think it's quite ambiguous. Insofar as, yes, the political energy was released. There has obviously been a discursive shift in certain debates, and there have been responses also on behalf of the Macron government to these protests, insofar as there was an enormous sensitivity in French politics around certain fiscal hikes on the lower classes that might usher in a second protest wave. So that is obviously an effect or a consequence that needs to be reckoned with. But since something like the Yellow Vest movement really did refuse the very idea that you'd have any representative structures in the organization. So anyone who's claiming to speak on behalf of someone does mean that, yes, it's not clear there's any institutional layers left. I think there's a really significant difference, let's say, between the first wave of protest after 2009, 2010, in which the indignados say, we are not represented, or they do not represent us. And that in itself is a claim about representation. It's also a claim about popular sovereignty, and thereby it has an immediate institutional index insofar as if they don't represent us, we want institutions or entities that do represent us, and that immediately entails a task of institutionalization or institutional horizon. And let's say the Podemos project afterwards entails the question of how can you maybe channel and sublimate the political energy into a more institutional and electoral setting, with, of course, the ambiguity that Podemos, as it existed in 2010, is no longer recognizable as such, has mainly disintegrated, but at least there's an institutional horizon. With the Yellow Vest, the claim is not they don't represent us, but we don't want to be represented. So you immediately ideologically exclude the potential of institutional representation, because those structures you see as intrinsically illegitimate. And I do think this is a different, and this is, I think, also an explanation on why something like the Indignados and Podemos were able to at least last for 15 years. So it's an animal with a life cycle of a decade and a half, while the Gilets jaunes, of course, have instilled a certain fear within the French political class that fiscal hikes will be a problem the next time they do them. But it's not as if any organization or institutions are around that you can recognize as the inheritors, or let's say a evolved form of the original creature that came out in 2017 or 2018. And I think these cases suffer from one essential problem, which is an issue that was already picked up in the discussion of the so-called color revolutions in the 2000s in Eastern Europe, which is they're very effective at instigating political revolutions. So a change of political personnel, a change in the form of the state, a change in the electoral system, let's say the rewriting of a constitutional code, but they're in no way close to instigating social revolution. So they are in many ways exclusively political, but not social revolutions. So the Ukrainian sociologist Vladimir Ischenko talks about this also in the Ukrainian case, where you say, if you look at the occupation of the state and the state personnel, or the constitutional buildup of the state, you can see that these protest movements do in fact succeed in changing those structures. But then if you look at the top 10 wealthiest people in the country, before and after the event, nothing has changed. And so there's no effect on property relations. There's not a real impact on the social power balance within society. And this means that all of these movements, even if they have some institutional heft, usually are most effective at affecting the political but not the social structure of a society. So they're very much focused on the state. And then when they look at, let's say, the power balance within society, once again with the Gilets jaunes, this is very clear. It's a fiscal movement. It's not a movement that is particularly hostile to employers. The workplace is not the site of politicization to them, but let's say the crossing, or let's say some kind of public square, the site of circulation, as other people have said, which obviously has very, very deep roots also in political economy in the last 30 to 40 years. But I think this is the permanent affliction of all these movements, is that they affect certain political structures, but social structures are usually beyond the purview of them. And I think this is also the question with the Gen Z protests in Nepal or the Bangladeshi revolution, is that the political change that happens, but the social change is very, very difficult to see. This was obviously less the case with 20th century revolutions. As something like 1917 or, say, the Cuban Revolution or even other revolutions later in the century have not just political but massive social effects as well, in that they completely change the composition of the elite. And today, I think that has simply become less recurrent. I don't think we've seen the same frequency of social change as we've seen the frequency of political change.
I do want to come back to an example of a sort of insurgent counter-elite in the American case, yes, which is, of course, the right-wing and the sort of far right-wing Trumpist movement essentially trying to, and successfully, placing itself not only at the center of state power, but in some ways at the center of a kind of a business state finance network, right? And that's very kind of striking, I think, in the last, even last year of Trump's presidency. But while we sort of have you here, right, thinking about France, thinking also about your home country of Belgium, right? Tell us about those institutional structures. So we have La France Insoumise, which is the Mélenchon party. We have the Belgian Workers' Party, which I don't know the French name of, so sorry. Or I guess it's just
the PTB, as they say. Yeah.
The Parti Travail Belgian.
Yeah, that's it. Parti
exactly.
Travail
My
Belgian.
GCSE French coming roaring back. Tell us about the kind of the ways in which those structures like do or don't confirm this thesis. Like, to what extent are those things you can see very reasonably projected 5-10 years in the future, and to what extent are they able to hit this kind of bedrock of social transformation, which is the transformation of social structure more widely than just the political sort of institutions?
Yes, so there are some internal differences to highlight here, insofar as La France Insoumise is not officially registered as a party. It has a very diffuse legal structure. It doesn't really have members. It has followers. In that sense, it does resemble some of the other new parties that usually have operated for more informal, less transparent or less classical setups. And there have been these repeated calls for La France Insoumise to become an official party, to register as one, and also to then involve all the followers as official members and thereby also ask for membership dues. Because there's obviously a question of funding and financial contribution that's very important there. But instead, what Mélenchon has mostly insisted on is to keep the party as a gas-like party, or parti gazeux, which to him, I think, implies two things. That it's the best way to operate within a heavily presidential system, which is very much dependent on the popularity contest which presidential election entails. That's very much centered around certain persons, and he's just very afraid that if he transforms La France Insoumise into something like an official party, he will not have the outreach, or will not have the visibility that the current more gas-like party grants him. And the second point with Mélenchon, and I think this is a very 20th century story, is a trauma about the cartelization or the oligarchization of the party he was previously a member of, namely the French Socialist Party, in which he saw that the battle between factions and the disagreements about strategy basically created this massive bureaucratic monster in which different factions were battling for control over the party machinery, and thereby also insulated themselves from society and made for a less immediate or less organic bond with the base. So I think he's traded that institutional dimension for a more political dimension, where he says, I can operate and I can link up with my base much more effectively if I don't have all the institutional weeds or all the institutional barriers between me and the people. So he wants a more immediate relationship with that. Now, the risk with that...
That's also the case for Macron, right, as well, right? Macron is also a former member of the Socialist Party. Yeah. Kind of weird to have them both in the same party.
Of course. I mean, so a very telling similarity, but with the difference, of course, that Macron mainly finds its constituency within certain factions within the state elite, and I think has less of a popular base even to rely on. But yes, there is just an obvious formal similarity in that they're both not official parties, they're not registered as such, and they try to get some unmediated, immediate access to a certain base. The obvious issue for that on the left, and I think you can now see this with Mélenchon when you look at the latest polling, is that he's not anywhere close to the kind of pole position he wants to be in for him to be able to beat Marine Le Pen, or depends on who actually runs, Jordan Bardella, in a second run, is that the lack of institutionalization on the left means that it is quite difficult for you to survive through different electoral cycles and to keep up that peak position, precisely also because you don't have access to private funds in the way that the right does. There's just a basic asymmetry in any capitalist society. The left-wing party is aiming for a set of goals that is much more ambitious and much more risky than anything on the right, while the right, in this hyperpolitical age, as the party of order, can just guarantee and stabilize an existing system rather than promising a transformative change. To get to the Belgian case, there I think it's more complicated insofar as the PTB, or the PvdA as they say in Dutch, has opted for a much more hybrid approach than even Mélenchon has. They are an official party, they're registered as such, they have an inner set of militants that are very dedicated and basically spend their entire lives within their party. They also donate half of their salaries, whether it's the European parliamentary salary or the Belgian the Belgian parliament's salaries, to the party. So they basically have a set of financial constraints or financial discipline that involves them in party life in a very direct way. But then there are these concentric circles around the party that gradually decrease the rate of participation within party life. You have the inner set of militants, the church militant. Then you have a second set of militants that usually participate in more temporary campaigns or also get involved during election time. And then you have a third set of militants that might, let's say, show up to canvass or knock on doors every 5 years, but are basically subscribers to a party newsletter, but are not people who show up to their party chapter every week. And this means it's a hybrid party insofar as there are different tiered levels of membership. Not everyone participates in party life with the same temporality. And the party both is a small militant church with a very strong core, and it's also a record spender on social media. So if you look at, for example, Belgian party's presence on TikTok or other online platforms, the PTB is actually one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent institution on there. I think that's the best example of what a hybrid looks like. It's a militant class party on a 20th century model, and then a TikTok-based digital party in the new sense. It's effective insofar as the party has existed for almost more than 50 years, and they're still rising, both in the polls and in terms of membership. So clearly they've managed to duck the trend that some of the other left populist outfits from the 2010s were prone to, in that they have a much longer survival range. It's a creature that hasn't died out yet. They clearly has a longer lifespan. But then there is an ambiguity that I don't think anyone on the left should be blind to, namely that it is a party that rhetorically has abandoned a certain class-based discourse, which it was still very much wedded to in the 1970s and 1980s. And much of its rhetoric revolves around a critique of state elites rather than economic elites. So there's a lot of anti-corruption talk. There is a lot of incessant criticism of the high salaries that politicians receive, of the intermingling between the public and the private, that I think defangs a potential more typical Marxist critique of economic power structures that are not purely political. I think this is the cost they pay for the hybrid approach they take, is that internally they're a Marxist party, but to the outside I don't think anyone would recognize them as Marxist. And there are many voters that obviously don't vote for them because they're Marxist, but precisely because they're an anti-elite or a more generic anti-establishment party. And this is, I think, a trade-off that anyone outside of Belgium should be aware of when they look at the PTB as a potential model. Yes, hybridity works. Yes, you have a longer lifespan if you go for this genetic mixture, but you also will be, let's say, dissolving or diluting the ideological purity of your party and there will be a question in the end of what do they stand for? Are they the Maoist power they used to be in the 1970s, or are they just a sort of generic anti-elite left populist outfit that in many ways makes arguments that you can also find on certain parts of the center left?
I guess, like, I would say, I mean, thinking about not only the Belgian Workers' Party, but also your party, that when people want to be ideologically pure in a very explicit and open way, that tends to result in things that don't really have much like immediate consequence. So, for example, a very kind of controversial or kind of actually quite famous example in the UK right now is, of course, the question that Zara Sultana has often been sort of putting to the Green Party, which is doing much better right now, which is like that they are not sufficiently anti-NATO. To be perfectly frank, and I'm not a political pundit, but that strikes me as completely absurd, right? Like this kind of like ideological purity, we must oppose this massive military alliance, right? Strikes me as just a thing that you would struggle to do even if you had a supermajority in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and somehow you find like a MI5, MI6 director who's like, yes, we'll leave NATO, right? Like, you know, the kind of institutional requirements to leave NATO are just enormous, and therefore this shibboleth, right, of ideological purity to say we must be, you know, kind of straight down the line about what we actually believe about the world, strikes me as not only kind of bad press, right, in that I think it's kind of vote losing, but also produces relatively brittle structures that are prone to falling apart. And I'm not, for the record, blaming Zara Sultana for the debacle of your party, right? That's not my position here. But there is a kind of like I kind of wonder, like, well, why do we want ideological purity? Like, that doesn't strike me as a kind of a straightforwardly like a thing that we would necessarily need either tactically or actually as a kind of matter of like being good at politics.
Yes, I think there are sort of two extremes here, which I think are unhelpful and indicate the problems in the strategic debate. There's either the swamp of total post-ideology, in which, as I say, you kind of trade width for depth insofar as you just insist on pure popularism, as the US pundits call it, and just look at a polling estimate of what particular opinion is popular within society and which you can capitalize on, and thereby you completely adjust your ideological menu to the pre-existing preferences that exist within a society that obviously is already quite heavily ideological. So you're reproducing ideology within society, but at the same time, you're just recycling it into a party program. So you become a kind of slavish follower of all kinds of polling trends, and you don't have any sense of what your own vision of social change would be. So I would say that if you notice that there's a broad majority within the British public that is pro-NATO, that is in no way a reason to somehow say that NATO should not be problematized or should not be questioned. So I think there is an issue that you cannot simply submit to current trends in public opinion to come up with something like a program. At the same time, the issue with purity is indeed that you will be making demands that are so institutionally unrealistic that you will simply look ridiculous to anyone you want to maybe draw into your movement. So if Sultana says, like, let's nationalize everything as a specific goal, it's not even a question of disagreement, but it's a question of saying, so what is the purchase you have on political reality that's going to get people into your organization? And if you trade in a certain kind of utopianism that indicates that you're actually serious even about building political control, but want to trade in the illusion of political control now and thereby maintain an ideological purity, then yes, that's not going to work in any way. I think the trade-off to have is to say, if you have the right kind of structures, you can instantiate a feedback loop between the base you're building and the ideological training you're going to provide to the base, in which you gradually build up more control on political reality, insofar as you also have a capacity to be more ambitious as well. But that to me means it doesn't even mean that you cede some of these ideological commitments. So it doesn't even mean you have to give up on the opposition to NATO. It's just a question of what do we prioritize when we speak to both our base and to the general public we want to engage in. And if you know that you don't get to decide on whether the UK is in NATO, and you know that there's a vast majority of Brits that also think it's unlikely that leaving might be good, maybe that is not the first theme or the first topic on which you want to politicize. I think that's the key point. It's not as if you have to openly say you're pro-NATO, but you want to orient yourself towards society and towards your own base in such a way that that is not the first topic you want to be participating in. And it also means that you don't want to give oxygen to certain themes which you don't consider as potentially beneficial to the growth of your organization. So the real luxury is to not have to force yourself to say certain things about certain topics. And so that no one even comes to you with the question of what you make of this or what you make of that. And I think the PTB in Belgium has been quite effective about that, is that they've not been involved in a lot of cultural warring. They've not let themselves be dragged into certain types of polarization which they don't consider as beneficial for their own organization, without thereby pandering either to certain far-right trends or thereby giving up certain ideological commitments. So they are an anti-NATO party, but they're a party that's very, for example, skeptical of how the current EU is ordered, but they're not a party that is publicly known as a party that, let's say, wants to organize a referendum on EU exit once they get into power. So they've not let themselves be polarized in such a position that they're now known as such a party. And I think because they have institutional structure to constantly negotiate and talk to their base and interact with them, they are able to do that. If you, of course, don't have the institutional structure and it's much more diffuse, yes, then you have the opposition between nationalize everything and become a kind of more millennial version of Blairism in which you sort of slavishly follow existing opinion, but in the end, you end up reproducing also the preferences of certain donors that also have the capacity to influence public opinion. Because Blairism obviously had the benefit that they had access to private funds and they controlled the press. And once those two benefits were lost, then you were basically in the wilderness.
I do want to kind of do a very hard pivot now to the question of fascism. We've been talking about things that seem very distant from that, but I'm going to go over there because I think it's a really important question, and I think it comes out of lots of these discussions. You mentioned earlier Timothy Schneider. We might also think of, God, what's his name? Wrote a terrible book called How Fascism Works. Jason Stanley.
Jason Stanley, yes, yeah.
Yeah. Who book tells you nothing about how fascism works. But the terrible list of examples. But I do want to do kind of two things here. One is to kind of propose a theory of fascism that I think makes sense and that gives you a relatively neat description of what it might be. And then also to say that, ask you the question about whether or not we see this kind of set of conditions coming back into play now. So the definition of fascism is goes like this, right? Fascism is, and this comes out of, to some extent, Michael Mann's work, but it's my own little kind of elaboration on top of that. Fascism is a form of coordination, a political form, that is about the coordination between three different components: racial mass movements, authoritarian states, and paramilitary violence. And you have to have all three, and they have to be working in some degree of concert together. So you have to be able to, it's not just that there are sort of terrorists in the country and you have an authoritarian state, right? They could be opposed. They could be only very lightly coordinated, or they could be like broadly have similar aims, but not be sort of the same kind of organization, or not be sort of, working symbiotically. But once you get these three things together, then I think you have a situation that looks a lot like fascism. I think the utility of this definition is that A, it's very short, right? And there is a lot of literature on fascism, right? And it's very voluminous and it's often very complicated. But also it's a definition that allows you to do something, right? So the task of the anti-fascist is not just to sort of oppose people who are bad, right? But the task of the anti-fascist is to disassemble this coalition as it comes into being, point out contradictions between different parts of it, and to make sure that each individual part gains less power, or that is kind of individually destroyed. And so that's the classical fascistic components. We then move in your sort of depoliticization story, right, to this position in the 1990s, where we have something that looks very, very, very different from that. There is a security state that rises in power through the late 20th century. There's a deepening distaste for political violence in much of the West. And that means you get much less paramilitary activity. You also get the kind of the neoliberal revolution that takes this mass society that you were talking about earlier, being a precondition for fascistic violence and for mass killing, right? Neoliberalism dissolves that, actually quite explicitly, right? This is one of the things that they are trying to do. They're trying to dissolve the conditions for fascism. It's strange, of course, now to think that neoliberalism starts as a kind of intellectual anti-fascism, right? We think of it like very much coordinated, but that is actually part of the intellectual lineage. There's something they're trying to do. The other thing is that racism becomes not absent in society by any means, right? It's still there, very much present, but it's discredited as a theory. And the state, which was previously very authoritarian and very enclosed, apart from to these movements of the extreme right, that state actually democratizes to some extent. You get a burgeoning civil society that can control it, and so you get this, dissolution of the fascist triangle, right? These three things start to come apart. And what I worry about is this question of the return of fascism, right? So I'm thinking particularly here about America. I'm not thinking about the UK or Belgium or any other countries you mentioned. I'm thinking here about America because we do have paramilitary violence, and it has two different forms, right? One sort of street protest movements, the Proud Boys and so on, but also this kind of quasi unaccountable institution of ICE. One of the massive things that has been really important for stimulating the recent surge in recruitment to ICE is that it promises to pay off people's debts,
yes,
right? So
absolutely.
You can get student debt forgiveness, and you get this massive $50,000 signing bonus. And so you have a kind of paramilitary violence here in two forms. We're getting an increasingly authoritarian state that is increasingly unaccountable, that bats away civil society and the movements of the mass politics that try and intervene in it. And then, but at the same time, we have new racial mass movements, right, which actually are constituted as an idea about nativism, and that these things are taking new institutional form in this relatively slippery way that they're built out of audiences, right? So audiences for Nick Fuentes, so-called groypers. There was one estimate I saw the other day, which is that about half of all Republican staffers under the age of 30 are regularly listening to or watching Nick Fuentes, right?
Yeah.
That's a racial mass movement in some form, right? It's not as coordinated as the 30s. It's not as total as the 30s. And the main point here is that these things are now acting in concert with each other. To me, to the perspective of this theory, this looks a lot like nascent beginnings of fascism. What do you say to that?
Yes, I mean, an excellent overview. I think the reference to man and the kind of institutional triangle you're dissecting is enormously helpful. There is one analytical issue with the original triangle, which I think bleeds into the second triangle you've set out here, is that to me there is a missing variable or a background factor, which is what is actually driving the genesis of these different variables themselves. And I think the missing element here is a militant labor movement. Not necessarily a pre-revolutionary one, but at least something like a labor movement that is affecting and impacting a social power balance with the perception or the prospect of potential, let's say, changes in the power balance that might be very threatening for certain groups. So as we said, the political and the social revolution in one go. There, I think, is a much more succinct definition of fascism, which is it's organized civil war on the labor movement. And organized has that element of coordination. Civil war implies, obviously, that it has to happen internally within a certain national community. That also implies why the racial rhetoric is taken on, because a racial form of nationalism gets you a form of cohesion in a social body that's profoundly split precisely through the labor movement. And war also obviously is related to the authoritarian state, which, as you indicate, also has this ancien regime element to it insofar as you have a section of the state elite that simply hasn't accommodated itself to democracy yet. And so that is very typical of the 20s and 30s, is that there are still these, let's say, aristocratic factions of the ruling class that are in no way easy with the idea that you should rule through democratic means rather than without democratic means. And I think this fascist triangle is very difficult to understand without the underlying factor of the labor movement driving all of these factions there. That doesn't mean that fascism in itself presupposes a very militant or revolutionary labor movement. But if you remove that element from the equation, it just becomes enormously partial. Because all of the paramilitary violence in both the authoritarian state and the racial mass movement is, in the end, a function of the actions of that labor movement. What we're looking at today is a fascist triangle. And once again, I do not want to deny that there are certain similarities or analogies with, let's say, fascist thinking and fascist action from the 20th century that don't exist today. Fascists exist today, whether we're talking about Fentes or like other members within Trump administration, but also in the UK, of course. It would be absolutely ridiculous to deny the ideological contiguity or continuity with what came before. But if you see fascism as this more holistic structural phenomenon that has certain preconditions, I just want to ask a couple of questions about what this would entail for the return of fascism today if we're looking at that triangle now. Namely, the militant labor movement has not returned in that recognizable integral form. This is obviously not a very pleasant diagnosis to make. It has a variety of roots. That doesn't mean, of course, that there haven't been attempts or there haven't been certain returns or social struggles that pose a threat to a certain power balance, but it is not taken on the form that we've taken in the 20th century. That, I think, profoundly modifies the equation we're looking at here on different levels. Because the authoritarian state, of course, the Gaussian regime state doesn't look like that today. The paramilitary violence we're looking at isn't responding to the same degree of threat. And also, as you say, the racial thinking takes on a very different form because it's solving a different problem than it did in the 20s and 30s. Insofar as the example of Fuentes you gave, I think, is very telling. Because you obviously have a certain cadre or a certain institutional layer that is listening to him. But being a subscriber is not the same as being a member of a specific organization. So obviously, loads of people got Hitler's voice beamed into their living rooms in the 30s and 40s already. But to have that kind of relationship to an institution that you listen to its podcast is not the same as actually being able to discipline or follow or command these organizations in such a way that you can be accountable or obey them in a very direct sense. And there I do think the second aspect, which is the experience of mass war, which of course is a formative element of how mass society came about, is absolutely crucial also in creating the institutional structures out of which fascism grows. So let's say Mussolini very explicitly describes the early party as the aristocracy of the trenches. So a group of people who felt they had no electoral representation in these post-war political systems. And then the Freikorps, of course, that then crushed the German Revolution in 1918, 1919, are once again explicit exponents of that crucial formative moment of mass war. The fact that that type of mass war doesn't exist anymore today, of course, the US has been at war constantly for the last 40 to 50 years, but it's not done so with something like a draft or the kind of mass involvement of the population as it did in the 20th century. I do think that completely changes the triangle because it means that, yes, the contemporary far right has a set of subscribers and it's broadening its ideological grip on society, but it simply does not have the institutional have to reproduce something like the mass politics of the far right. This doesn't mean that nothing scary can happen. That doesn't mean that, for example, with ICE, there is an attempt to refound some of these institutions, but it's proven quite difficult. And I think the best example you can give of this is of something like the Unite the Kingdom march you saw last summer in the UK, is that if you look at the turnout for BNP marches all through the 1990s and 2000s, which were already a regular occurrence at the time, I think they were usually capped at a maximum of 10,000 attendance. And these were people who I don't think were all in the same sectarian organizations, but they might have known each other, let's say, from the back rooms of certain pubs. They might have gone to certain types of meetings before. They've known each other from these they had organizational prehistories with each other, and this means that the maximum they could draw is 10,000. Now the estimates for turnouts for Unite the Kingdom are 150K. So a very, very impressive multiplication of the number of attendants. But it's very clear that they've also traded, once again, width for depth, insofar as many of the people who are there might be listening to the same podcasters, they might be watching the same movies, they might be in the same Telegram and WhatsApp groups, but they're not in the BNP or the same far-right organizations, and they don't have a relationship prior to the march with the fellow marchers, and they don't necessarily stay in the same organizations after they leave the march. So obviously they have the benefit of private funding added to this. So Elon Musk can obviously provide some financial firepower for the march to be beamed into onto everyone's screens, but they don't have the organizational density to maintain that type of activity over the longer term. I do think that reform is hoping to crystallize or hoping to consolidate the people who marched in the summer into something like a voting bloc that could also go to a reform pub, that could furnish some council candidates for the next elections, that could maybe create certain platoons that can knock on doors when the next general election comes along. I'm happy to be falsified. I'm not happy. That's not the correct. I can accept the idea. I won't be happy if that hypothesis or prediction it turns out to be successful. So if it's invalidated, then that's obviously I will accept that it's wrong. But I see profound ambiguity there, precisely because the two underlying variables in the triangle, which were there before, namely mass war and the militant labor movement, are lacking. And this, I think, renders everything more volatile. So the kind of fascist dynamic you're describing, in which Malcolm Mann also talked about, is there, but in a very attenuated, weaker form. It can have massively destructive consequences. And I'm going to give one counterfactual that really illustrates what I'm talking about, is the Israeli case. What is it about Israeli society that has made it much more prone to fascisation, and thereby also the types of mass killing that were much more recurrent, I'd say, in the 20s? It's the militarization of Israeli society, and the fact that it is a society in which everyone does have to serve in the military when they turn 18. That doesn't mean there aren't other ambiguities to the experience there. Like, it's a highly technological, capital-intensive form of killing. It's a genocide that's obviously done not through the kind of mass engagement, also from a distance. So it's not as if it's not a 21st century phenomenon. It clearly is. But I do think that the experience of mass involvement in military affairs is really, really crucial to explaining why we've seen this type of mass violence in that society, and why that looks much more like a 20th century fascism than the other forms we see.
I guess I would the other example I would kind of throw in here, which maybe sort of complicates things again, is the BJP in India, right?
Yes,
where there is not the same experience of mass war, but there is a mass party. It is clearly Hindutva is a strongly, straightforwardly racial ideology. There is this paramilitary kind of violence, and that doesn't come about through mass war, right? That doesn't come about through like mass conscription even. Or rather, it comes out through a sort of process of caterization. So people joining organizations, being trained inside it. And the BJP and the RSS, which is this sort of sister organization, they do that process of like almost military style training, but inside the political party, right? And that's not something we see in the West very much anymore, which is good. I would say on this question of sort of the labor movement, I totally get where you're going with that. I think that is obviously a very fundamental part of it. I don't think that, and this is always the question with fascism, right, which is maintaining its, obviously in the Nazi case, most like straightforwardly, it's like extreme anti-Semitism, and trying to say that is some sort of function of a attempt to suppress the labor movement strikes me as a little bit flattening. I don't believe that. Right? I think that the anti-Semitism is autonomous, right, in that process. And I think there is something that we can say that is roughly analogous in the US now, which is very strange, and it feels hallucinogenic to say it, because there isn't that kind of like anti-labor movement thing. There isn't a pre-revolutionary situation as you get after the First World War in Germany. There is a hallucination that BLM or woke or like, you know, the left are about to take over. I don't think you can sort of separate this, like this feeling of counter-revolution that the right genuinely does have, right, of suppressing a revolution, even if we on the left think, well, it really wasn't a revolution, or didn't have this kind of revolutionary stakes. They do, right? And so there is that kind of hallucinogenic element to it.
Yes.
But I think that's an important part of it as well. And so the stories do seem in that dimension relatively similar.
But the question is, what classes believe this? And with fascism, there is, of course, a perceived threat to a certain social order in certain parts of the middle or even the working class. That's clearly part of the more popular constituency that Nazism and fascism is able to draw in, even if that's ambiguous. But it's also very clear that fractions of German and Italian capital perceive a social threat to their power. And I think that is a difference with what we see in the US now. I do not think, except for, let's say, certain sections of the tech bourgeoisie, or its Musk, that American capital sees a real social threat to its rule. That is not the case. And I think you just need to open any American newspaper or like the FT or the Wall Street Journal to see that they are not in any way afraid of that prospect happening. What is absolutely true that some other social classes that are not as high in the income distribution, or let's say don't have the same position of social power, do perceive this, and they are, of course, a natural constituency for the fascisation that we're describing here. But as long as capital doesn't have that perception, I do not think you can ever return to the man trial or the sort of triangle that you set out here. And once again, it's not a very optimistic diagnosis to make, precisely because it indicates that they don't see the social threat that you would like the left to pose in a pre-revolutionary situation.
Yes, I mean, the kind of the horrible strategic tension here is that, of course, as someone on the left, I do want capital to fear the workers. And at the same time, that is one of the essential preconditions for this actual proper refascisation, right? That is the sort of the strategic disaster of leftism that doesn't succeed.
There's not a self-illusion, but there is a type of gentrification of your own political action going on in the ascription of the term fascism to your enemies, because it implies that you're overestimating or you're implying that you're already a social threat to the existing order in the way that you're not. And I know this is slightly catty and a bit psychoanalytic, but it is absolutely true that fascism gentrifies or upgrades what you're doing into something more than what it is now. And this means, indeed, that the real risk of the return of mass politics on the left, or the reinstitutionalization of mass political engagement in a social dimension in which a militant labor movement will reappear on the scene, whatever that looks like in the 21st century, does, as you say, imply that the reactive or the result of that will be a return of mass politics on the right. And then things will get generally scary, as they did in the 20th century. But that is the wager that anyone took in the 20th century. And I do think we need to be very clear about this, that it's not going to be cozy, it's not going to be pleasant once mass politics returns on the left, because we know what the logical response to this mass politics on the left used to be throughout the 20th century. Of course, there are all kinds of different routes, all kinds of different path dependencies we can talk about here. But even many forms of 20th century reformism implied revolutionary threats. As someone says, the WTO, what's it called? Not the WTO, but the ILO, International Labour Organization, was founded in response to the foundation of the Comintern. So reformism presupposes revolution in a very, very clear sense. And I think that's also the case that, yes, once you have mass politics return on the left, that might imply that much scarier creatures are going to be born on the right, because then there will be a true perception of a threat to their social order.
Yes. I think that the other thing to keep in mind with the fascism debate and the kind of the question about it is that lots of bad things can happen that aren't fascism, right?
Absolutely.
Not every enemy is a fascist, right? And not every situation that is horrible is fascistic. You can still have a genocide without having a properly fascist situation. Of course. Right? These are.
It's a particular disease in the American case. We don't have to go on for this about too long, but there is, I think, also a severe ignorance of the precedents for this within American history that I think implies a slight denial about what America actually is, or what American history consists of. So there is a schizophrenia there insofar as America has also been prone to these primal original sins, but at the same time, there's a complete unexceptionality to the current situation that somehow distinguishes it from everything that came before. But sort of deportation machines or mass violence or extreme state repression are things the American state has proven enormously adept and good at throughout the 19th and the 20th century. And it could be, of course, that we're facing a new formation of this, but to pretend as if this is a qualitative change to what came before, I find deeply, deeply suspicious.
There was a meme about sort of 10 years ago about blockchain. People were like, I'm going to add blockchain to my thing. And yeah, there's kind of the response is always like, you don't need a blockchain to do that. And I often feel like with just talking about the kind of social violence that just like permeates capitalism and even liberal capitalism all the time, there is a sort of like you don't need fascism to do that, right? Like,
of course.
You can do mass violence without fascism. Well, you can't do mass violence necessarily. You can do extremely consequential violence to lots of people without fascism. On which hopeful note, I want to say thank you.
In some
Anton
way,
Jäger.
yes. Thank you so much. Thank you.